Okay, we are at 1 o'clock. Leanne, we have almost everyone. I think we're still missing about 3 or 4. I don't know if you want to give them more time or if we should just go ahead and get started.
Maybe we'll give them 1 minute and then we'll get started.
All right.
I think maybe that picked up another person or two, didn't it?
Yeah. Actually about 2 or 3, so I think we're good. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Aaron Yao. I'm the DFO. I'm the designated federal officer for the CASAC PM panel. In my role as DFO, I'd like to formally open this public meeting. The CASAC is an independent expert federal advisory committee chartered under the authority of the Federal Advisory Committee Act. The CASAC is empowered under the Clean Air Act to provide independent advice to the EPA administrator on the scientific and technical bases for EPA's national ambient air quality standards. FACA and EPA policy require that CASAC meetings be announced to the public in the Federal Register and that substantive deliberations and interactions with EPA and the public be conducted in open sessions where DFO is present to ensure that the requirements of FACA are met. FACA also requires that public meetings provide an opportunity for oral and written public comment. There are public comment periods noted on the agenda where members of the public have registered in advance with the SAB staff office to make oral comments. There are also clarifying public comment periods noted on the agenda where members of the public may request an opportunity to make short clarifying comments, providing new additional information to the CASAC panel. I ask that members of the public wishing to do so to send me an email. Written comments have also been received, and these have been sent to the panel members as well as been posted on the CASAC meeting webpage. Minutes will be prepared to summarize discussions and action items in accordance with the requirements of FACA. I will work with the chair to certify the minutes and have them posted on the CASAC website. The CASAC panel consists of special government employees appointed by EPA to their positions. As government employees, the members are subject to all applicable ethics laws and implementing regulations. The SAB staff office has reviewed and evaluated panel members' financial disclosure forms, responses to supplemental ethics questions, information provided by the public, and information gathered by SAB staff. The SAB staff office ethics officials have determined that advisors participating in this meeting have no financial conflicts of interest or appearance of a loss of impartiality relating to the topic of this meeting. For those on the phone, I'd like to note that we do have a live video webcast of this meeting. To access it, you can go to the CASAC website, casac.epa.gov, then click on the CASAC PM panel meeting, and you should see the link to the video webcast. For those watching the live video webcast, please send me an email indicating your attendance. If you have previously requested a call-in number, then you do not need to email me again. I'd now like to turn the meeting over to Dr. Leanne Shepard, Chair of the CASAC.
Thank you, Aaron, and welcome to everybody joining this meeting, both panel members as well as members of the public. We really appreciate your participation. I wanted to start by summarizing the goals of CASAC, and our first and most important goal is to provide useful advice to the Environmental Protection Agency with a focus on whether the documents that we're reviewing are adequate for their intended purpose. I also hope that we have a good collegial give and take, a discussion about the charge questions and the science that is related to them, and that we reach consensus if at all possible. And historically, we've done a great job reaching consensus. In terms of meeting outcomes, our goal is to provide consensus responses to the charge questions. And so for each discussion that we have about each charge question, we want to ensure that our discussion is sufficient such that the assigned discussants feel prepared to draft a consensus written response, which we will discuss later in a teleconference. We will also address additional comments and suggestions that may not be covered by the charge questions, if there are any. And the last thing I wanted to mention is, in our advice to EPA, we want to distinguish between changes we recommend versus changes that would be nice to have in this document or in a future document. And when we write up our consensus responses, as members of previous panels probably recall, we often use the language recommended versus suggested to distinguish between those two kinds of advice, things that we want to have happen as part of the response to our review and things that we suggest for the future or if EPA has time to address them. So I'm going to move on now to the overview of the agenda. So today we have public comments, and each public commenter will get 5 minutes. And then the panelists are free to ask clarifying questions before we move on to the next public speaker. We will take a 20-minute break after the comments on the integrated science assessment, and then have public comments on the draft policy assessment. Moving on to the next 2 days, tomorrow and Friday, we'll be going through each individual science, integrated science assessment supplement charge question in order, one at a time, except that we will address the first charge question last, since it talks about the executive summary. So we'll do that after we've discussed all the document before we review the executive summary. And then I also wanted to note that we divided the workload on charge question 4 on the health effects evidence evaluation into 3 parts, corresponding to the 3 subsections in section 3. We did this even though the charge question focused broadly on the entire section 3. And I've noticed from our preliminary comments that panelists have taken a range of approaches to responding. So we've continued to break the agenda down into the 3 subsections, followed by overall comments by the leads of the 3 subsections. But when we get to that part of the agenda, I encourage panelists to respond as they wish, either more broadly or more narrowly. And then when we come to the summary of the health effects section on Friday, I'll ask the leads to revisit the discussion and make sure they have enough information to respond to that charge question. I'll review the December policy assessment discussion agenda in December. And I also wanted to mention and affirm what Aaron said, that members of the public are welcome and invited to provide clarifying comments at the end of the integrated science assessment and the policy assessment discussions. And then just a couple of meeting requests. I asked the panelists turn on your video when speaking. Of course, you're welcome to have your video on any other time you wish. And also that you use the raise hand function when you wish to speak. I think it'll be easier for Aaron and I to manage who wants to speak. So now, unless there's any questions or comments, I'll move to introductions. So first we'll introduce the panel, and then we'll invite EPA Office of Research and Development staff to introduce themselves. So with respect to the panel, we'll start with the Chartered Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee members, and then move on to the consultants. I note that we introduced ourselves at our October 14th meeting, and because of lack of time, those were pretty short. So today I welcome panel members sharing not only your affiliation, but also summarizing your areas of expertise. So I'll start with myself. I'm Leanne Shepard, and I'm the Roman Haas Professor of Public Health Sciences at the University of Washington. I have appointments in both environmental and occupational health sciences, as well as biostatistics. I'm a biostatistician by training, and my interests are in health effects of environmental and occupational exposures and exposure assessment and modeling, particularly with respect to how that informs our ability to assess health effects. So moving on, I invite Michelle Bell to introduce herself.
Hi, thank you. Having some connectivity problems, so my video will go in and out as I need to. Thank you so much. I'm very glad to be here. I'm Michelle Bell. I'm the Mary E. Pinchot Professor of Environmental Health at Yale University at the School of the Environment, with secondary appointments in the School of Public Health, the Environmental Health Sciences Division, and also in the Environmental Engineering program. My training is in environmental engineering, epidemiology, environmental management, and philosophy. And I primarily work on how different environmental conditions, especially air pollution, are associated with human health impacts, with strong interests in the health implications of climate change and in environmental justice. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is James Boylan.
Hi, my name is James Boylan. I am with the Georgia Environmental Protection Division. I am the Assistant Branch Chief for the Air Protection Branch, and my areas of expertise are emissions inventory development, ambient monitoring, and regulatory modeling.
Thank you. Judy Chow.
Hi, my name is Judy Chow. I'm a research professor at the Division of Atmospheric Sciences of Desert Research Institute. We're part of a University of Nevada higher educational system. My research of interest area including monitoring network design, PM gas and particle sampling, chemical analysis, and the receptor modeling source apportionment. Thank you.
Thank you. Mark Frampton, you're next.
Sorry. Mark Frampton from University of Rochester, where I'm a professor emeritus in the Department of Medicine in the Pulmonary and Critical Care Division. And my research interest has been in human clinical studies of air pollution using our environmental chamber facilities at the University of Rochester. My original training is as a physician, and I became interested in air pollution research during my pulmonary and critical care fellowship at the University of Rochester.
Thank you, Mark. Next is Christina Fuller.
Hey, good afternoon. My name is Christina Fuller, and I'm an associate professor at Georgia State University School of Public Health. And my earliest training was in environmental engineering. And I was also trained later in graduate school in exposure science and epidemiology. And so the majority of my research has to do with measuring the fate and transport of air pollutants in the environment in relationship with health outcomes. I also work on environmental justice issues, health disparities, and also community engaged research. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next is Alexandra Panet-Gonzalez.
Hi, my name is Alexandra Panet-Gonzalez. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Geography and the Environment at the University of North Texas. My research focuses primarily on atmosphere-biosphere interactions. Specifically, I'm interested in atmospheric deposition effects on terrestrial ecosystems. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So moving on to the consultants, my understanding is Peter Adams is not able to participate today. So we'll move on to George Allen.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Lan. My name is George Allen. I'm the chief scientist at NESCOM. That's out of Boston, Massachusetts. I'm a former chartered CASAC member and also was a member of the 2019 Independent PM Review Panel. My expertise is in measurement methods, aerosol science, and exposure assessment. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Next is John Baums.
Hi, John Baums. I'm a physician scientist. I'm a professor emeritus at the School of Medicine at University of California, San Francisco, and also a professor emeritus at the in the Division of Environmental Sciences at UC Berkeley School of Public Health. I have been doing air pollution health effects research for many years, have been on multiple K-Sac review panels, and I'm also the physician member of the California Air Resources Board.
Great, thank you. Next is Jane Clougherty.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jane Clougherty. I'm an associate professor at Drexel University Dornsife School of Public Health. I'm an air pollution exposure scientist and epidemiologist. My expertise is in social susceptibility to air pollution, that is synergistic effects between chronic social stressors and air pollutants, as well as in interurban variation, fine-scale urban variation in multiple air pollutants. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Next is Deborah Corey-Schlechta.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Deborah Corey-Schlechta. I am a professor in the Department of Environmental Medicine with secondary appointments in pediatrics, public health sciences, and neuroscience at the University of Rochester Medical School. My area of expertise is neurotoxicity, neurotoxicology, and for about the last 10 or so years, I've been working in examining the impacts of ambient ultrafine particles, as well as metal exposures from air pollution on developing brain and latent effects on brain later in life. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Terry Gordon.
Hi, I'm a professor at NYU School of Medicine, and my research focus is anything air pollution, occupational or environmental.
Thank you. Michael Kleinman.
Hi, I'm a professor in the Department of Environmental and Occupational Health at UC Irvine with a joint appointment in the Department of Medicine. I am an inhalation toxicologist, and I'm the co-director of the Air Pollution Health Effects Laboratory. And the studies there involve exposure studies with inhaled contaminants, including air pollutants and other substances like that. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Stephanie Lewinsky-Desir.
Hello, I'm Stephanie Lewinsky-Desir. I am Chief of Pediatric Pulmonology at Columbia University Medical Center, and my research focuses on air pollution exposure and childhood respiratory disorders, particularly asthma, and thinking about urban environments and with a lens towards health disparities.
Thank you. Next is Jennifer Peel.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. I'm Jennifer Peel. I'm a professor of epidemiology at Colorado State University and the Colorado School of Public Health. I'm an environmental epidemiologist, and most of my research focuses on a variety of health effects of air pollution, both in the US and in low and middle income countries from household air pollution as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is David Rich.
Hi, I'm David Rich. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Public Health Sciences at the University of Rochester. I have secondary appointments in the Department of Medicine, Pulmonary Critical Care Division, and in the Department of Environmental Medicine, also at the University of Rochester. I'm an epidemiologist and primarily study air pollution and associations with cardiorespiratory outcomes, as well as reproductive or birth outcomes.
Thank you. Next is Jeremy Sarnat.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jeremy Sarnat. I'm an associate professor of environmental health at Emory University in the Department of Environmental Health. My research focuses mainly on characterizing both exposure and health response to urban air pollution, specifically looking at ways in which exposure science informs environmental epidemiology. Of late, a lot of my work has turned to molecular level markers of both exposure and response to air pollution.
Thank you. Next is Neetha Thakur.
Be joining us in a few minutes.
Okay. All right. Well, maybe we can give her a chance to introduce herself later. Barbara Turpin.
I'm Barbara Turpin. I'm a professor and the chair of the Department of Environmental Sciences and Engineering at the Gilling School of Global Public Health at UNC Chapel Hill. And I'm trained in environmental engineering and aerosol science. I do atmospheric chemistry, especially with regards to the formation of organic aerosols, exposure science, indoor air chemistry, and I've done some visibility research.
Thank you. Next is Mark Weiskopf.
Yes, hi, thank you. So my name is Mark Weiskopf. I'm the Cecil K. and Philip Drinker Professor of Environmental Epidemiology and Physiology at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health, also with an appointment in the Department of Epidemiology. I have a background having done a doctorate in neuroscience, laboratory neuroscience first, and then a doctorate in epidemiology. And my current research sort of melds those two. I look at environmental risk factors, including air pollution, for neurological outcomes kind of across the age spectrum, as well as a strong interest in causal inference methods, in particular as how they relate to environmental health studies.
Thank you. And last is Corey Ziegler.
Hi, I'm Corey Ziegler. I'm an associate professor of statistics and data science at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm in the Department of Statistics and Data Science, and I also have an appointment in the Dell Medical School here at UT. I'm a biostatistician. I focus on biostatistical methods, in particular for observational studies and causal inference methods for environmental epidemiology and environmental accountability studies.
Thank you very much. So that's everyone. When Neetha joins, we'll see if we can give her an opportunity to introduce herself. I think now we are ready to move on. I understand that it would be better for the EPA Office of Research and Development staff to introduce themselves tomorrow. So we'll start that agenda out tomorrow with their introductions. And so now I think I'm going to turn the meeting over to Aaron Yao in order to manage the public comment process. And I remind committee members that you're welcome to ask clarifying comments, questions of any public commenters, and just raise your hand so we can call on you.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and start with a public comment period at this time. I just want to remind the public commenters about our ground rules. You will be limited to 5 minutes to make your oral statement. There will be a visible and audible 5-minute timer to help you keep the time. When your 5 minutes are up, you'll hear a brief alarm, at which time please finish your sentence, and then we'll have to move on to the next speaker. To make the best use of your time, please focus your oral comments on the documents under review. Other comments can be included in the written comments and referenced in the oral statement. Input from the public to the CASAC panel will have the most impact if it provides specific scientific or technical information or analysis for the CASAC panel to consider, or if it relates to the clarity or accuracy of the technical information. And then lastly, please remain professional and civil, refraining from any personal attacks. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. Our first speaker will be Richard Smith with the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And Will, I believe Richard has slides for this one as well. Yes.
Okay, you ready for me to start?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, and should I just announce to somebody's operating the slides, somebody's going to advance it when I say so?
Yes.
Okay, all right, good. All right, thank you very much then. So I'm Richard Smith. I'm a professor at UNC. I'm a member of the Science Advisory Board. I'm a member of a National Academies Committee looking at causality in EPA studies. The study I'm going to report was partly financed by an industry sponsor. The views I express here are entirely my own views and don't reflect the opinions of any of the above. Next slide, please. I'd like to begin by just thanking EPA and K-Sac for organizing the public comment session. I know in my meetings of SAB, I've sometimes found public comments very helpful in orienting the discussion, and I hope you find today similarly helpful. Next slide, please. So the study I'm talking about, it's a study of short-term mortality of PM 2.5 above and below 12 micrograms per meter cubed. It was based on Medicare data. It was taking PM 2.5 and temperature and dew point data from various sources. statistical analysis by the case crossover method, and looking at different types of concentration response functions, linear, non-linear, and what I like to call the broken stick model, which is two straight lines joined at, in this particular case, 12 micrograms per meter cubed, and also considering meteorological adjustment using nonlinear functions of temperature and dew point, both current day and average of 3 lag days. Next slide, please. Results. Positive statistically significant dependence between mortality and PM2.5 when the linear CR function is fitted to the full range or the broken stick model above 12 micrograms per meter cubed, no significant effect below 12 micrograms per meter cubed. However, if the lagged meteorology component of that model is omitted, the effects are larger across the board and statistically significant in all ranges. These results are robust across various sensitivity analyses, and nonlinear concentration response curves confirm a similar discrepancy. If you could show the next slide, please. This is my first graphic, which shows the linear coefficients in 3 bands, both the range unrestricted and above 12 and below 12. The top block of estimates is for the model that includes lagged meteorology. And you can see on the right hand there that the results for below 12 micrograms per meter cubed are basically not significant. The second block is shows dramatically larger effects if we leave out lagged meteorology. And the third block is just a bunch of a number of sensitivity results. And now next slide, please. So here we have some depictions of the nonlinear curve expressed as a change in relative risk relative to 12 micrograms per meter cubed. The left one is including the lag temperatures and shows a generally slight overall increase, especially in the left-hand part of the plot. The right-hand one without lag temperature is a much sharper curve. Next slide, please. Relevance to the ISA. Well, there's another study. This study obviously is not in the ISA, but there's another study that does rather similar things. And that study did not include the lagged meteorology effect, but it did find highly statistically significant effects. So I believe that particular study was deficient. If they had investigated the confounding effect of lagged meteorology, I believe they would have found the same thing as I did. Next slide, please. So discussion. So let me be very clear. This is not about discrediting that particular group of researchers. They're a very well-known group who've made many creative contributions, but I want to address a couple of broader issues, namely publication bias and reproducibility. Next slide, please. So this paper that I just referred to, in its original form, it was submitted to one of the major epidemiology journals. The referees found no fault with the paper, but the editor rejected it. And after extensive correspondence with the editor, I felt I had no choice but to withdraw it. It's about to be resubmitted to another journal. So I do not dispute the right of journal editors to select papers for publication as they see fit, but I believe this kind of process creates a definite bias in the way EPA does its assessments. Next slide, please. A bit about reproducibility and transparency. So the previous administrator of EPA introduced a transparency rule, which various commentators, including his own scientific advisory board, objected that the rule was unworkable. That rule has now been reversed, but I think there has been no further progress towards replicability. So last slide, please. So this is recommendations, or maybe I should say suggestions. EPA ought to consider establishing a public database similar to what's used in the clinical trials world, so that there's a public database of air pollution studies that should retain the results regardless of their outcome. If such a system had been in place 2 years ago, I would have submitted my results to that, and there would be no argument about their eligibility for the ISA. I would like EPA to consider establishing some sort of a process for reanalysis. And finally, I think K-Sac should include replicability as an explicit criterion that they use in weighting air pollution studies. So I'm just inside about 5 minutes. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for that. I see Michelle Bell has a question.
Richard, how are you?
Hi, Michelle.
Good to see you. Super quick question. You mentioned at the beginning and in your slides that this work has an industry sponsor. I don't know if you're able to tell us who the sponsor is.
The organization that managed the contract was Gradient, and they were sponsored by a consortium of industry groups, one of which was the American Petroleum Institute. And I can't remember the names of all the others, but there were a bunch of them that are acknowledged in the paper.
All right, thank you.
Are there any other clarifying questions or comments? Okay, thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
Okay, our next speaker will be James Endstrom with UCLA and Scientific Integrity Institute.
Hello. Can you hear me? All right.
Yes, go ahead.
The September supplement to the 2019 PM ISA must be objectively redone because it deliberately falsifies and exaggerates the adverse health effects of PM 2.5 and incorrectly claims that PM 2.5 causes premature deaths. The ISA focuses almost exclusively on the positive associations between PM 2.5 and mortality that have been promoted by the Chinese-funded Harvard Chan School of Public Health since the publication of Dockery 1993 and Pope 1995. 8 key investigators, including Dominici, Schwartz, Pope, and Bell, are cited 171 times. Dominici's 30 Chinese co-authors are cited 263 times. In addition, 8 Canadian investigators are cited 211 times regarding positive associations in Canada that should not be in the ISA. On the other hand, the ISA does not cite the published null findings and criticism of at least 60 investigators, including myself and prior CASAC chairs Cox, McClellan, and Wolf. Although there is an ongoing 30-year controversy about claims that PM 2.5 causes death based on secret science findings that are not transparent or reproducible, the 303-page ISA does not contain the words controversy, transparency, reproducibility, and integrity. The ISA totally ignores my independent 2017 CPS2 reanalysis, which found major flaws in Pope 1995 and the 2000 HEI reanalysis. If my reanalysis had been possible in 1997, the PM 2.5 NOx might never have been established. Most of the recent US evidence on PM 2.5 deaths in the ISA is based on complex statistical analyses of US Medicare records. However, I have been unable to confirm that Dominici, Schwartz, Bell, Ziegler, Shi, and others have proper authorization to use Medicare records for methodologically flawed air pollution epidemiology. 69 million Americans, including myself, have never granted permission for our private Medicare records to be used for ecological research that violates basic epidemiologic principles and produces weak associations that are claimed to be causal. Furthermore, I believe that individual Medicare recipients can be identified from the detailed de-identified information used by Dominici et al. Such identification would directly violate Americans' HIPAA privacy rights. In addition to the falsification of the published research record, the ISA does not cite any of the unpublished null PM 2.5 findings that have been rejected by many prominent journals that publish positive PM 2.5 findings. For instance, Science rejected without review my proposed response to its repeated opposition to the EPA transparency rule. JAMA rejected my letter to the editor pointing out that the Feinberg-Allison viewpoint opposing EPA transparency did not cite my 2017 reanalysis. The New England Journal rejected my letter to the editor countering the New England Journal Science Sounding Board the need for a tighter particulate matter air quality standard by K-Sac Chair Shepard and her co-authors. Thus, Shepard and other members of the PM panel are already unequivocally in favor of tightening the PM 2.5 NACs of 12 micrograms per cubic meter without regard to the extensive contrary evidence by at least 60 PM 2.5 critics. There is no etiologic mechanism by which inhaling 100 micrograms of PM 2.5 per day can cause death. And the US already has a very low PM 2.5 level of 7 micrograms per cubic meter, whereas our competitor China has a very high level of 48 micrograms per cubic meter. Thus, I am making a very strong case to Americans that tightening the PM 2.5 NACs will hurt America. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comment. Is there any panelists wish to ask any clarifying questions? Seeing no hands up, I will turn it over to Aaron for the next public speaker.
Okay, so our next speaker will be David Hill with the American Lung Association.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to share some comments from the American Lung Association on the external review draft of the supplement to the 2019 Integrated Science Assessment for Particulate Matter. We will submit more extensive comments in writing to the committee. My name is David Hill. I'm a practicing pulmonary and critical care physician in Waterbury, Connecticut, and I serve as a faculty member on all 3 medical schools in the state. I speak today in my role as a member of the board of directors for the American Lung Association, where I also serve on the scientific and medical editorial review panel. The American Lung Association appreciates the diligence and thoroughness of the EPA staff in preparing this assessment. As one of the organizations that petitioned EPA for reconsideration of the 2020 National Ambient Air Quality Standards for Particulate Matter, we applaud the agency for making the decision to reconsider based on the scientific evidence. The reinstatement of K-Sac PM panel is a gratifying demonstration of this administration's commitment to the critical role of science in guiding sound policy decisions. Taken together, the 2019 Integrated Science Assessment and the recent supplement have provided extensive evidence that strengthens the case for setting more stringent standards for particulate matter. We agree with EPA's conclusion of a causal determination for premature deaths from both short-term and long-term exposure to particulate matter. We also support the affirmation of previous findings of a linear no-threshold relationship between long-term PM 2.5 exposure and all-cause mortality across the range of exposure concentrations well below the current standard. EPA recognizes the abundant evidence from numerous studies that demonstrates beyond question that PM shortens life. The Lung Association also appreciates the inclusion in its review of a closer look at the evidence for disparities in exposure and risk in populations with environmental justice concerns. The evidence base for this disproportionate impact of PM on communities of color is growing rapidly, and the recent findings clearly merit the committee's attention. We recognize the public health need for a streamlined process for reconsideration, and we believe that there is more than sufficient evidence for strengthening the PM standards in the current draft supplement of the ISA. However, we have concerns about the precedent being set by limiting the review to only those health endpoints that were identified as having a causal relationship in the 2019 ISA. The Clean Air Act explicitly recognizes the uncertainty in scientific research and its requirements to periodically review the air pollution criteria and to err on the side of protection. This precautionary principle requires that EPA set air quality standards to protect against effects suggestive of causality. You won't find what you don't look for. Since the 2018 cutoff date for inclusion in the 2019 ISA, there have been a number of important studies published that could have the potential to influence the outcome of this reconsideration if they were included. For example, Kravitz-Werz et al. In the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health in 2018, and Garcia et al. In JAMA in 2019, reinforced earlier findings linking exposure to fine particles with the onset of asthma in children. Another study from Coleman et al. Published in Environmental Health Perspectives in 2020 analyzed more than 8.5 million cases of cancer incidences from U.S. registries and were able to establish a consistent association between the incidence of lung cancer and exposure to 2.5 PM air pollution. Research on the impact of PM exposure on reproductive, developmental, neurologic, and metabolic health is also advancing rapidly and should be taken into account when evaluating the overall public health burden of this deadly air pollutant. We will include more detail on some of these findings in our written comments. The recommendation this committee makes to EPA have the potential to quite literally be life-saving for many Americans. The American Lung Association urges you to follow the science and to act assertively to protect those most vulnerable to illness and death from particle pollution. Thank you for the opportunity to comment.
Thank you very much. Checking now to see if anybody on the committee has any clarifying questions. Okay, hearing none or seeing no hands up, I'll turn it back over to Aaron for the next public speaker.
Okay, so our next public speaker will be Amabola Murasiru with American Petroleum Institute.
I hope everyone can hear me.
Yes.
Thank you. Well, good day to you all, and thank you for the opportunity to speak before you today. I am Amabola Murasiru, a science advisor with the American Petroleum Institute. I followed the last K-Sac review of the PM NACs as well as the independent PM review panel's work. I appreciate the tremendous challenge facing the panel, given your review task by necessity will require the review of the draft ISA supplement as well as the 2019 ISA, followed quickly by a review of EPA's recently released updated 2020 PA. In API's efforts to contribute to the science on air pollution epidemiology, particularly ozone and particulate matter, we worked a few years ago with EPA scientists, academic experts, and other industry consultants to hold a causal symposium on causal methods in epi studies of PM and mortality. The product of this work was published in several journals, as well as other commentary highlighting the current evidence on causal analytical methods and opportunities for additional research, including some of the work touched upon by Dr. Smith this afternoon. Another noteworthy project was one that focused on bridging the gap between Epi and Risk Assessors. This effort was undertaken by a diverse group of EPA and industry scientists, and the team focused on a simple question: what do risk assessors need in order to be able to improve the value of EPI research for use in decision-making? The result of this work was published. Based on the success of these collaborative efforts, I am working with others to put together a workshop on accountability studies to strategically examine the quality of these studies and how they can be better applied in the regulatory decision-making process. As I read through the draft ISA and revised PA, I commend the work of EPA's Office of Research and Development on the ISA, as well as the Office of Air and Radiation on the PA. I understand EPA's focus on relationships that are causal as part of the evaluation of the existing evidence to date. Despite the strong conclusions made in the ISA in support of a causal relationship between PM and cardiovascular mortality, I will assert that most of the newer studies are subject to many of the same methodological limitations, such as exposure measurement error, confounding, irrelevant exposure windows, and so on. As studies also reviewed in the 2009 and 2019 PM ISAs, we therefore believe that they do not meaningfully reduce the uncertainty of the evidence. Together with others, I am actively working on projects to address some of these limitations in these study types. An example of some of our work include a quantitative bias analysis project to examine how the choice of statistical tools adopted in EPI studies could lead to an artificial association between exposure and outcome, in this case, PM. We're taking a simulation approach to showcase the bias and how it can possibly impact study results. I also note with interest newly published data from hyperlocal monitoring studies that show significant variability in PM 2.5 exposure block to block. While some of these studies need to be assessed carefully, we believe that these outstanding issues suggest that significant uncertainties still remain in our understanding of the relationship between exposure to PM and some observed health effects. Last year, as did many others, we reviewed with interest a body of literature on the intersectionality of PM and COVID-19. Beyond the possible impacts themselves, the role it may play in disproportionate impacts on sensitive populations was of particular interest. Despite the volume and the timeliness of published studies, we agree with the EPA that these studies should be interpreted with caution, as most of them were of ecological design or faced methodological issues that significantly impact the results. We also respectfully ask the panel to review carefully the ISA supplement summary of studies for at-risk population. This is an important issue that calls for transparent and objective analysis. As I mentioned previously regarding developing a workshop on accountability studies, we recognize EPA's inclusion of this growing body of work in the ISA supplement. We are convening a diverse group of experts to address and provide simple guidance for accountability studies that will account for adequately measuring interventions and health outcomes, such as timing, confounders, background trends in air quality, and other regulatory actions occurring concurrently, as well as solicit ideas from others on gaps and limitations. I look forward to sharing this process and collaborating with the EPA. Again, EPA's efforts in producing this document in a very short period of time is commendable, and I appreciate the challenge facing the review panel. Thank you thank you all for the opportunity to introduce myself and briefly speak about the efforts I'm coordinating to clarify how science conducted in the NAAQS review might best inform regulatory decisions of the EPA. Thanks again.
Thank you very much. Checking now to see if there's any panel members who wish to ask a clarifying question. Okay, seeing none, thank you for your presentation. I'll turn it back over to Aaron.
Okay, our next speaker will be Giff Johnson with the National Council for Air and Stream Improvement.
Thanks, Aaron. I'm Dr. Giff Johnson. I'm speaking today on behalf of the National Council for Air and Stream Improvement, or NCASI. NCASI is a research organization that assists the forest products industry in meeting their environmental and sustainability goals. Before joining NCASI, I spent about 10 years as faculty in the Toxicology and Risk Assessment program at the University of South Florida, and served as the Assistant Director of Research at the Center for Environmental and Occupational Risk Analysis during this time. We are impressed with the efficiency with which EPA staff have prepared the supplement to the ISA. The conclusions reached by EPA staff from this exercise is that the state of the science is essentially the same as it was at the end of the previous review. And in general, we agree that the state of the science remains the same in that new studies have used similar methods and similar approaches as previously reviewed studies to address exposure assessment, confounding factors, and the statistical characterization of concentration response. Unfortunately, this also means that the substantial amount of uncertainty and potential for bias and confounding continues to exist in the body of evidence, and without systemic approaches to shaping the conclusions through analysis and application of risk of bias in this literature. This leads us to reiterate the need for modern systematic review approaches for reaching causal conclusions regarding health effects potentially related to policy relevant concentrations of criteria pollutants in the NAAQS process. Systematic review frameworks serve to uniformly and transparently address uncertainty and bias within a set of literature, to weigh and integrate lines of evidence within the context of bias and uncertainty, and to provide a more realistic characterization of confidence in the conclusions drawn from a literature review. Lacking this, the supplement for particulate matter does not adequately characterize uncertainty and bias that exists across lines of evidence. NCASI, in collaboration with subject matter experts, has developed a systematic review protocol for evaluating the potential impact of PM 2.5 on cardiovascular mortality at policy-relevant exposure scenarios. The protocol and the related article reviews will be submitted to the docket as an attachment of NCASI's technical comments on the supplement to the ISA. 3 articles newly cited in the ISA supplement that evaluate associations between PM 2.5 and cardiovascular mortality, Kraus et al., Wong et al., and Chen et al., have been taken through the process of data extraction, risk of bias evaluation, and discussed in terms of evidence integration as prescribed by our protocol. Our review indicated that none of these articles are of sufficient quality to serve as primary lines of evidence, and these articles are likely to be representative of the evidence base as a whole. The larger body of evidence fails to address the need for individual level exposure data, individual level confounding data, and a systematic approach to determine a concentration response threshold and nonlinear concentration response curves. Small measures of association are highly susceptible to bias and confounding, as subtle amounts can produce these small effects. Large measures of association insulate overall findings of causation from subtle amounts of uncertainty, bias, and confounding, and they are simply not present in the PM 2.5 evidence base, necessitating a rigorous risk of bias evaluation. Additionally, observational epidemiological studies are not the same as controlled toxicology studies. In toxicology studies, the animals have the same environmental conditions, food and exercise, they have the same genetics, they have the same external stressors. We know exactly how much exposure each animal receives, and we know the specific pathology for each animal in the experiment. Observational epidemiological studies are deficient or absent in most of those factors and cannot tell us the same information at the same resolution. It is noticeable that there are no animal toxicology studies available that corroborate the low concentration effect relationships produced in some of the observational epidemiological evidence base. The lack of a clear risk of bias analysis and specific criteria by which to integrate this analysis into developing conclusions can lead to an illusory confidence in the evidence base. A systematic review approach, as presented in our written comments, avoids these pitfalls and can rigorously evaluate the current body of literature. An approach that uniformly and consistently weighs health-related findings for uncertainty, bias, and policy relevance is critical for a reliable conclusion that adverse health effects occur below current criteria. I'd just like to thank the K-Sac and EPA staff and their time for listening to these comments and reviewing our written technical comments.
Thank you very much for that. Checking now with the panel to see if anybody has any clarifying questions. Okay, thank you. Seeing none, I turn it back over to Aaron for the next speaker.
Okay, our next speaker will be Dan Costa.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dan Costa. Although I've been working with the Environmental Protection Network and American Thoracic Society, in this statement this afternoon, I'm speaking for myself. I've been directly involved in air pollution health research for 47 years, 34 of which were at EPA in both research and management capacities. As was the case for the 2019 ISA, my review of the supplement is positive. The science review is largely well-structured to support consideration of stricter annual 2.5 NACs. However, my primary message today is to emphasize the need for a more careful review of the evidence for 24-hour PM 2.5 NACs and to affirm the need to tighten the daily standard considerably. I would suggest a maximum level of 25 micrograms per cubic meter. It is clear that great progress has been made in reducing air pollution, notably with the evolution of the PM NACs begun in 1970, and especially since the promulgation of the PM 2.5 standards in 1997. At present, the national annual average for PM 2.5 is less than 8 micrograms per cubic meter, with only 3 states having multiple counties in non-attainment. This improvement in air quality and health welfare gains is widely acknowledged to have been credited by the establishment and subsequent tightening of the annual PM 2.5 NACs. However, I would posit that the daily standard has largely been a stepchild to the annual NACs, drawing much less attention either in research or in risk assessment and policy development. The undercurrent thought has been that the daily levels will mirror, perhaps with a lag, the reductions in the annual average, and undoubtedly pushing down peak values contributes to the overall reduction in the annual average as well. The monitoring network used to ensure compliance is a network which, by design, avoids major sources of PM. This contributes to a hazy, a pun intended, protection of public health to millions of people who experience daily and sometimes, some cases, hourly PM 2.5 exposure excursions. The science cited in the ISA and supplement clearly shows significant, yet oddly underemphasized risk with such exposures, which in my opinion is further undervalued in the PA itself. The ISA cites several studies focusing on higher risk with environmental justice, socioeconomic status, pre-existing health conditions, etc., with several post-ISA studies noted in section 3.3 of the supplement reinforcing this concern. The data for high exposures in people of color and social disadvantage are clearly noted with evidence. For example, Tessim et al. In 2021, that shows the importance of point sources. Yet the argument developed in the PA is that these short high exposures are covered by a margin of safety, which is in keeping with traditional development of the NACs. At this point in the evolution of the annual PM 2.5 NACs, most Americans, although not all, are on average at lower, yet not zero risk. Tightening the annual standards certainly will protect many people in the US. However, I would argue that at this point, the focus should be on those at high risk due to daily shorter peak exposures with health or social disadvantages. We do our analysis the same old way right from the beginning, when perhaps it is time for us to reverse our thinking. The SES-EJ database is clearly not nearly as rich as the full Epi base, but the evidence demonstrates risk to many communities is so much higher. Growing satellite data show that many are exposed at higher levels than the monitors reveal, even with sophisticated exposure models. Reliance on large Epi studies for statistical strength, even with newer causal inference approaches, generally do not focus on the local societal health burdens. The link lies in the empirical health data in controlled human studies, as well as in the panel studies that have been conducted over the last 15 years. And these are supported by the animal toxicology as well. In 2019, ISA had panel studies in humans, for example, Zhang et al. In the supplement, that are largely lumped together with the Epi studies, whereas undervalued in my opinion. Taken only as affirmation of plausible causality, the impact these studies reveal on daily and hourly exposures via effects on inflammatory and cardiopulmonary variables in elderly and at-risk populations at or below the daily NACs is entirely missed. Further, the panel study findings are strengthened by controlled human exposures at varied ambient PM levels, showing coherent cardiac inflammatory markers in healthy people. This brings us to the EJ issue. EPA administrator in this administration has declared that EJ is at the focus of our policy and funding. So it's important for us to take this opportunity to move forward with greater anticipation of positive findings. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. I'm checking now to see if there are any panel members who have clarifying questions to ask. Okay, seeing none, I turn the meeting back over to Aaron for the next speaker. Thank you.
Okay, our next speaker will be Sam Wilson with the Union of Concerned Scientists. Sam?
Hi, good morning, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are, everyone. Thanks so much for the opportunity to comment today. My name is Sam Wilson. I'm a senior vehicles analyst with the Union of Concerned Scientists based in Oakland, California. UCS is a group of scientists and policy experts who advocate for public policies guided by rigorous and independent science. EPA's reconsideration of the science presented in the previous ISA for particulate matter could not come soon enough. With record wildfire seasons becoming the norm in the West, backups of container ships spewing toxic air pollution off our coasts, and already disadvantaged communities suffering both health and economic impacts from breathing diesel exhaust from heavy-duty trucks and delivery vans in their neighborhoods, EPA must fulfill its legal mandate to consider the latest and best science when setting the NACs to adequately protect human health and the environment. The draft ISA you're considering here is a significant step in the right direction after the previous administration's consistent and effective attempts at replacing rigorous analysis with convenient conclusions that typically favored profits over people. As Administrator Regan recently noted, science is the reason that Americans have cleaner air and longer lives, and our air quality standards must be based on the best available science. The supplemental ISA provides strong evidence that the current PMNACs do not adequately protect people's health and safety, as they're set at levels significantly above what's determined to be protective. The science has been clear at this for some time. The EPA must use this information to set standards at levels that meet the agency's charge to protect public health and welfare and the productive capacity of our communities. We are encouraged to see a focus on the effects of fine particulate pollution on disadvantaged communities in this ISA. Many recent studies clearly show that communities of color and low socioeconomic status neighborhoods experience higher levels of exposure to PM than their whiter or wealthier counterparts. While this inclusion was a positive step, we were somewhat disappointed to see the EPA adequately consider the cumulative health impacts exacerbated by exposure to particulate pollution. Communities that face high PM exposures are also disproportionately exposed to multiple pollutants and other environmental stressors, which can compound and lead to greater disparities. We urge EPA to keep this at the forefront when considering the PM NACs and to expand monitoring in these communities so that we have the analytical tools to address disparities in exposure to particulates and other toxic air pollution. UCS urges EPA to expand its consideration of environmental justice in understanding and addressing PM emissions, and to set the PM NACs based on the latest and best science. Strong science-based PM NACs are a critical tool not only for guiding appropriate federal action to protect public health, but are also the basis, the legal basis rather, for state actions that reduce transportation emissions, our nation's largest source of climate warming and NOx pollution. State regulations leading the transition to electric vehicles, especially in the heavy duty sector, depend on strong federal air quality standards to advocate for and adopt policies that electrify our transportation sector. What's more, our neighbors, friends, and families depend on these strong air quality standards to live healthy, productive lives. Yeah, thanks so much for your time today and the opportunity to comment, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Checking now with panelists to see if you have any clarifying questions, comments. Okay, hearing none. Aaron, you want to introduce the next speaker?
Yes, our next speaker will be Samuel Delk.
Hi, everyone. My name is Samuel Delk. I'm a PhD student in toxicology, and I was raised in California's Central Valley, which has some of the worst PM levels in the state, which is why this issue has always been of particular interest to me. I'd like to draw attention to page 2 of the executive summary of this document, which states that this further supports causality determinations made by the 2019 report in regards to PM 2.5 and mortality and cardiovascular effects. Now, I think a much closer inspection of this issue is warranted before a causality determination can be made, especially when we're talking about PM concentrations ranging from 5.9 to 11.6, which are among the lowest in the world compared to nations like China or India, which have more than 5 times these concentrations. So the relationship between PM 2.5 exposure and mortality has obviously long been a contentious debate. And I think there are legitimate reasons to question the integrity of this science being used to justify increasingly strict standards on NACs. So a couple years ago, a thorough analysis on the data transparency and scientific integrity of this topic was put out by Intrepid Insight, which is a nonprofit consulting corporation with extensive expertise in statistical analyses and data science. And this report they put out is publicly available on their website, and I strongly encourage the K-Sac to look through it. So the focus of this analysis was on an article from Pope and others in 1995, which is cited in this 2019 ISA supplement, as are numerous other publications from this research group. And as I'll soon demonstrate, there are some very concerning issues with this publication, which I think undermine the integrity of the ISA document as a whole. And this isn't a specific attack on a specific group or author, but I think is rather emblematic of how scientific integrity is so easily undermined at the intersection of science and politics. So again, I'm just a grad student. I don't have an organizational affiliation. I just want good science, and I'm interested in this issue because it's, like I said, it's always affected the region that I've grown up in. So this Intrepid Insight paper quotes a critique by James Endstrom, who I actually see was on the call earlier. It was a critique of this Pope 95 publication, namely that data from 35 cities was omitted from the analysis with no explanation as to why it was. And Endstrom followed by performing his own analysis of the data and reached a different conclusion, but was constrained by the amount of data made available. Because despite these subpoenas by the US House Committee, the American Cancer Society refused to release the original data set that Pope used in '95, which effectively makes a full independent analysis impossible. So it seems to me that this specific data omission and lack of data transparency is just a piece of a much larger puzzle of dishonest science being used to inform public policy. These decisions do affect the public, and it's like, what's the point of having a public meeting and a public comment section if the studies that inform this document lack data transparency? And I could go on. This Intrepid Insight report includes numerous meta-analyses with data suggesting no causal link between PM2.5 and mortality and cardiovascular effects. So in closing, I think the K-Sac ought to consider this lack of data transparency when analyzing the supplement to the ISA, because frankly, I don't have a ton of confidence that such issues are limited to a single publication out of the numerous, hundreds of publications in this document. So as a member of the public health research community, again, I'm a PhD student in toxicology, it's really important to me that reproducibility and transparency are paramount when considering public policy decisions. So thank you very much to the board for hosting this opportunity to comment.
Thank you for your comments. John Baums.
Thank you, Mr. Delk. I just you may have said, but what institution are you a doctoral student at?
I'd prefer not to disclose my institutional affiliation.
But why?
Just for privacy reasons.
Well, you're giving just public Google testimony. It, so I just Googled it. You could just Google it, John.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. I think it's interesting. You give public testimony and you're not willing to say what institution you're from.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else have comments or questions? Okay, hearing none, I will turn this back over to Aaron for the next speaker.
Okay, our next speaker will be Steve Malloy with junkscience.com.
Good afternoon. I'm Steve Malloy at publishjunkscience.com. EPA's assessment of the PM2.5 science is a case study in science fraud. First, the PM epidemiology is not science. It's just statistics, and dishonest statistics at that. Statistical associations by themselves are not science. EPA admitted in federal court with me that the PM epidemiology alone is inadequate for determining causality. This should be no surprise. It's basic epidemiology, not that the PM epidemiology is worth anything to start with. In fact, the data used in the PM epidemiology are mostly garbage. Exposure data are poorly guesstimated and often overwhelmed by other PM exposures, especially smoking, occupational exposures, and indoor air. PM health endpoints like mortality are common and multifactorial, and so are not positively studied with epidemiology. It's no wonder that EPA allows agency grantees to hide their data from public scrutiny. Even so, all the PM epidemiology essentially reports are zero correlations. Honest epidemiologists know that epidemiology is only useful for studying high rates of rare disease, not low rates of common health endpoints like death. And let's not forget that EPA staff continues to essentially ignore all the PM epidemiology that expressly reports no association between PM and death, like the 2017 study by Young, Smith, and Lopiano that considered every death, 2 million of them, that occurred in California between 2000 and 2012 and reported no association between PM and deaths. Let's consider PM toxicology, which should be able to shed light on whether there is any biological plausibility to the notion that PM kills. There's no lab animal experiment that has produced deaths in animals, despite intense PM exposures. There's no human clinical experiment that has produced health effects, let alone deaths, despite exposing elderly and sick people to intense PM. None of this is surprising since there are no real-world examples where PM has killed anyone ever. Yet EPA staff dishonestly assesses this body of literature as supporting its false assertion that PM causes death. Please, EPA, show us the body of someone who has been killed by PM. Just one, please. Are you even curious yourselves? There are supposed to be 8 million deaths worldwide annually caused by PM 2.5, and you can't find a single body? Studies show that smokers who quit by age 40 will have inhaled thousands of times more PM than non-smokers, yet both groups can have the same life expectancy. PM levels in Chinese and Indian cities can be 100 or more times greater than US outdoor air, but there are no reports of actual deaths from inhaling Chinese or Indian air. Historic incidents of deadly air pollution during the 20th century were caused by acidic gases concentrated in the air by weather phenomena. They were not caused by PM 2.5. Coal miners and diesel workers have relatively large exposures to PM, but they have greater life expectancy than workers not occupationally exposed. And guess what? When PM levels are reduced, deaths don't go down. Yet EPA staff ignores this real world data, doubles down on the fraudulent and secret science, and raves that PM 2.5 is more dangerous than ever. It's a shameless con, and it's getting worse. EPA staff now claims that cleaner air is more dangerous than just regular air. EPA staff claims that when it comes to cardiovascular mortality, the dose response curve goes super linear at low doses. Of course, that would mean that tightening the PM 2.5 max would actually kill people. There's not a single toxic substance known to science that operates on the principle that a little exposure is worse than a lot. Not a single one. All the foregoing is indisputable. At least I have seen no one dispute it. So how did all this fraud take hold in the first place? Well, since 1996, the first time K-Sac told EPA that there is no evidence PM 2.5 kills, EPA staff funneled at least $600 million to university researchers willing to commit scientific fraud in order to invent and maintain the lie that PM kills. After the 1996 K-Sac debacle, EPA staff saw to it that future K-Sac review boards were staffed and controlled by the same researchers funded to commit the PM science fraud in the first place. And that's what happened until K-Sac was reformed in the last administration. Now we are back to the good old days of EPA's K-Sac cronies doing the bidding of EPA staff and rubber stamping their fraudulent interpretation of PM 2.5 literature and reality. If I'm wrong about anything of what I just said, I'd love to hear about it, but I know you won't dare. You would just hide behind conclusory statements and 1,000-page long unreadable summary documents, Byzantine process, paid off academia, and a media that is as dumb as EPA is dishonest. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for your comments. I'm checking now to see if there's any members of the panel who wish to ask a question or make a comment, clarifying. Okay, hearing none, I'll turn the meeting back over to Aaron for the next speaker.
Okay, our next speaker will be Nicholas Nasikas with the American Thoracic Society.
Good afternoon. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
All right. I'm Nicholas Nasikas, and I'm a pulmonary and critical care physician and air pollution researcher at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in Boston, Massachusetts. And I speak today on behalf of the American Thoracic Society, an international organization of physicians, scientists, and allied healthcare professionals with more than 16,000 members, dedicated to the prevention and treatment of pulmonary disease and critical illness. Our members are thought leaders in studying the adverse health effects of exposure to air pollution. Thank you for this opportunity to address the supplement to the 2019 Integrated Science Assessment for PM 2.5. I have 3 key points that I would like to make. First, the current daily and annual EPA standards for PM 2.5 are not protective of public health. As described in the supplement to the ISA, studies have clearly demonstrated that short-term exposure below the current daily standard of 35 and long-term exposure within the current annual standard of 12 cause mortality and adverse cardiovascular effects. My second point, ATS recommends revising the current daily PM 2.5 standard to 25 micrograms per cubic meter. As described in the supplement to the ISA, short-term PM 2.5 exposure causes mortality, a relationship that persists at concentrations below 20 micrograms per cubic meter, and is supported by strong epidemiologic evidence in multiple studies. In a Medicare population where 93% of participants were exposed to concentrations below 25, short-term exposure to PM was associated with an increased risk of death. There was no evidence of a threshold for this relationship. In children and adults under the age of 65, short-term exposure is associated with increased risk of respiratory emergency department visits. The reconsideration of PM standards should also recognize low socioeconomic status as a risk factor for higher PM 2.5 exposure and a greater risk of adverse health effects resulting in health disparities. Furthermore, as noted in the supplement to the ISA, the short-term health effects of PM 2.5 are not confined to cardiovascular or respiratory disease. Short-term exposure is linked to an increased risk of hospitalization and death from ischemic stroke. And when the World Health Organization recently revised their guidelines for short-term PM 2.5 to 10 micrograms per cubic meter, they cited the association of short-term PM exposure with cardiovascular, respiratory, cerebrovascular mortality, and the lack of a safe threshold. Based on scientific evidence, we recommend revising the daily PM 2.5 standard down to 25 micrograms per cubic meter. My third point, ATS recommends revising the level of the annual PM 2.5 standard to 8 micrograms per cubic meter. Scientific evidence continues to demonstrate health risks associated with long-term PM exposure at levels below the current annual standard of 12. In fact, 3 core United States-based studies, along with multiple other studies, provide strong epidemiologic evidence of adult mortality risk from what has traditionally been considered a low concentration of long-term PM down to levels of at least 8 micrograms per cubic meter. These 3 studies, all in populations of Medicare recipients, demonstrated an increased risk of death with long-term PM exposure below the current standard of 12. Furthermore, African Americans and urban residents had a higher risk of death. These Medicare-based studies are compelling. 2 include 13 to 60 million Americans of diverse background across the US over a decade of time. Recognizing the negative effects of PM on the health of vulnerable populations is especially important. In the US, veterans, Black individuals, and persons living in neighborhoods with high levels of disadvantage had increased PM 2.5 associated mortality. The pursuit of environmental justice requires the adoption of PM 2.5 standards that will protect these most vulnerable populations, who in particular are not currently protected by our existing standards. Based on scientific evidence, we recommend revising the annual PM 2.5 standard to 8 micrograms per cubic meter. We want to emphasize, however, that the revised daily annual standards we recommend are not based on the level at which there is zero risk. There is no evidence to support a threshold for PM 2.5 below which the health effects of air pollution are non-existent. In conclusion, the current daily and annual PM 2.5 standards are not protective of human health. The ATS recommends that EPA revise the daily standard to 25 and the annual standard to 8 based on scientific evidence. Thank you for your time and attention today.
Thank you for your comments. Does anybody on the panel have a clarifying question or comment? All right, seeing none, I turn it back over to Aaron for the last speaker in this section.
Okay, the next speaker will be Robert O'Keefe with the Health Effects Institute.
Thank you, Aaron, and good afternoon. I'm Bob O'Keefe, Vice President of HEI. The Health Effects Institute is pleased to have the opportunity to submit comments to K-Sac on the new draft Supplemental Integrated Science Assessment for PM. We are encouraged to see that the draft continues to adhere to the high standards of scientific quality and careful review of the literature that has become a hallmark of EPA's approach to meeting the requirements of Section 108 of the Clean Air Act. As you're aware, HEI has produced a large number of studies of air pollution and health to inform the review of national ambient air quality standards, and we're pleased to see that several of those studies, along with the commentaries, are included. We focus today on 2 major points: the consideration of causality and the results, now in press, of one of several key funded studies of low levels of exposure to PM and ozone, the study in 68.5 million US Medicare recipients. First, on causality, HEI has followed closely the development and application of EPA's criteria for assessing causality of different air pollutants on diverse health outcomes since they were first applied in 2008 and updated in the ISA preamble in 2015. We found that this approach has been a significant enhancement over previous reviews, especially because it includes well-stated criteria for causality determination presented a priori in the preface of each ISA. Second, careful evaluation of evidence from all strands of research, exposure assessment, toxicology, clinical studies, and epidemiology, rather than reliance on only one strand of evidence or solely on statistical causal analyses. And finally, explicit acknowledgement of the uncertainties attendant in each case. The result of this process is an open presentation of the literature and assumptions applied, and the opportunity for both K-Sac and the broader community to review and raise questions about those determinations. Second, comment on the results of the latest report of HEI's low-level studies. HEI has focused especially closely in recent years on testing the concentration response relationships at the lowest levels of exposure in the United States, Canada, and Europe. We published phase 1 reports of the US and Canadian studies in November of 2019. Now the primary work of all 3 studies has been completed and has been subjected to independent peer review by the HEI Low Exposure Epidemiology Studies Review Panel, chaired by Sari Vidal of the University of Washington. The European ELAPSE study by Brent was published in September 2021, and the Canadian MAPLE study is in the last stages of review. The report of the 3rd team, led by Francesca Dominici, conducting analyses in some, as I mentioned, 68.5 million US Medicare recipients, has now been intensively reviewed and accepted for publication. It is now in press at HEI. This is the first comprehensive review of all of the results of the analysis and includes the extended and detailed commentary prepared by the HEI review panel. We would hope that CASAC and EPA could consider and include this overall report in the final supplemental PM ISA when completed in 2022. In brief, the main findings of the report are: first, the investigators presented results from 3 newly developed causal inference approaches using generalized propensity scores and from 2 traditional regression approaches. Their findings of associations from the new approaches were consistent across all 5 approaches. Second, the investigators reported increased risks of all-cause mortality of 6 to 8% for 10 micrograms per meter cubed increases in PM 2.5 across the 5 approaches, with stronger associations at the lowest levels of exposure below the current annual national standard of 12 micrograms per cubic meter, even when adjusting for potential confounding from other pollutants. Finally, and overall, the HEI Low Exposure Epidemiological Studies Review Panel of the Review Committee at HEI appreciated the substantial strengths of the studies, including provisions to make all of the data and methods accessible. At the same time, they noted several continuing uncertainties to be considered in applying the results to assess risk at low levels. Ultimately, the panel considered a major contribution of this study that, using several different approaches, the investigators produced findings of robust associations of air pollution and mortality across their several analytic approaches, again with stronger associations at the lowest levels. Thank you very much for the opportunity to submit these comments.
Thank you very much. Checking now to see if any members of the panel have any clarifying questions or comments. Okay, seeing none. The next on the agenda is actually a 20-minute break. Looking at the time, it's 11:22, so we'll come back at 11:42.
And that's 2:42 for those on the East Coast.
Yes, that's right. 42 after whatever hour on whatever time zone you're at.
11:42 works for me.
All right, see you soon.
Okay, we are at 2:42 Eastern Time, 11:42 Pacific Time. Leanne, did you want to go ahead and get started?
Yeah, I think we can get started. We're going to move into the public comments on the policy assessment, but first, if she's available to introduce herself, I wanted to invite Neetha Thacker, who was not here, to introduce herself. You can tell people your affiliation as well as summarize your areas of expertise.
Yes, certainly. Sorry to be a few minutes late at the beginning. I'm Neetha Thacker. I'm an assistant professor at University of California, San Francisco. My area of expertise is examining the interactive effect of environmental pollutants and social stress, particularly in vulnerable populations, and then thinking about how do you work with communities to strategize on place-based interventions.
Great, thank you. So now moving on to the public speakers for the policy assessment, I'll turn it over to Aaron to introduce the first speaker.
Okay, so our first speaker will be James Endstrom with UCLA and Scientific Integrity Institute.
Hello. The October PMPA must be objectively redone because it deliberately exaggerates the adverse health effects of PM 2.5 and makes policy recommendations that are based on invalid claims that PM 2.5 causes premature death. The PA focuses almost exclusively on the positive associations between PM 2.5 and mortality that have been promoted by the Chinese-funded Harvard Chan School of Public Health since the publication of Dockery 1993 and Pope 1995. 8 activist U.S. investigators, including Dominici, Schwartz, Pope, and Bell, are cited 315 times. Dominici's 30 Chinese co-authors are cited 399 times. In addition, 8 activist Canadian investigators are cited 353 times regarding positive associations in Canada that should not be in the PA. On the other hand, the PA does not cite the published null findings and criticisms of at least 60 investigators, including myself, prior K-Sac chairs Cox, McClellan, and Wolf. Although there is an ongoing 30-year controversy about claims that PM 2.5 causes deaths based on findings that are not transparent and reproducible, the 649-page PA does not contain the words controversy, transparency, reproducibility, and integrity. The PA totally ignores my independent 2017 CPS2 reanalysis showing major flaws in Pope 95 and the 2000 HEI reanalysis. If my reanalysis had been possible in 1997, the PM 2.5 NAAQS might never have been established. Rather than acknowledging my reanalysis and errors in PM 2.5 death claims, HEI has increased funding of research associating low levels of PM 2.5 with deaths. Most of the recent US evidence on PM 2.5 deaths is based on complex statistical analyses of US Medicare records. However, I have been unable to confirm that Dominici, Schwartz, Bell, Ziegler, and She have proper authorization to use Medicare records for methodologically flawed air pollution epidemiology. 69 million Americans, including myself, have never granted permission for our private Medicare records to be used for ecological research that violates basic epidemiologic principles and produces weak associations that are claimed by EPA to be causal. Furthermore, I want the opportunity to show that individual Medicare recipients can be identified from the detailed de-identified information used by Dominici and her co-authors. Because of their extensive use of Medicare records, I expect PM panel members Bell and Ziegler to give me this opportunity. As previously stated, Shepard and other members of the PM panel are unequivocally in favor of tightening the PM 2.5 max of 12 micrograms per cubic meter without regard to the extensive contrary evidence by at least 60 PM 2.5 critics. Keep in mind, there is no etiologic mechanism by which inhaling 100 micrograms of PM 2.5 per day can cause death, and the US already has a very low level of 7 micrograms per cubic meter, whereas our competitor China has a very high level of 48 micrograms per cubic meter. Given these facts, the Biden EPA should not be focused on tightening the PM 2.5 max, while the Chinese are sending their PM 2.5 across the Pacific Ocean to America, building new coal power plants, testing new hypersonic missiles, and elevating President Xi to the historic status of Mao Zedong. Finally, the PM panel should be aware of the writings of renowned journalist John Tierney on the left's war on science, of renowned physicist Lawrence Kraut on the ideological corruption of science, and of Endstrom on environmental Lysenkoism in California and the United States. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. I see Jeremy Sarnett has his hand up.
Yeah, thank you for the comments. Could you just clarify what your affiliation is with UCLA right now? And what department and in what capacity?
I am a retired research professor of epidemiology, and I am currently president of the Scientific Integrity Institute, which contains hundreds of documents backing up my statements. I had a career at UCLA that started in 1973, and I was wrongfully terminated in 2010 for making the kind of comments I'm making today.
Okay, so thank you. So no current affiliation with
I'm retired, and I have access to UCLA resources.
Thanks for answering the question.
And I use my UCLA email. If you want to email me, I'd be glad to engage in a dialogue.
Thank you. Anybody else have a clarifying question or comment? Seeing none, I'll turn it back to Aaron.
Okay, our next speaker will be Albert Rizzo with the American Lung Association.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to share some comments from the American Lung Association on the draft policy assessment. Dr. Albert Rizzo, the Chief Medical Officer for the American Lung Association. And I'll share some brief summary of our comments today. We will follow up with our full comments in writing. American Lung Association appreciates the diligence and the thoroughness of the EPA staff in preparing this document. In general, we find much to support in their assessment. They have attempted to provide a full, extensive review, including addressing the shortcomings of the previous review that precipitated the need for this reconsideration. As a science-based organization, the Lung Association is pleased and relieved that EPA has revised the process for this reconsideration of the PM standards with an emphasis on science. In particular, we appreciate the reconstitution of the K-Sac chartered panel, the reinstatement of the PM panel, and the examination of some of the literature that has been published in the last 4 years on the health harms from this deadly pollutant. We appreciate that in the draft PA, EPA included an examination of the relationship between PM 2.5 exposure and health outcomes with both a causal and likely to be causal relationship. However, we believe that the fact that the supplement to the 2019 ISA does not include more recent findings about respiratory health, cancer, and nervous system effects may have affected the results of the risk assessment in ways that will hamper the ability to fully evaluate the policy implications of the evidence. The evidence included does clearly demonstrate the potential for public health benefit from more stringent standards. The risk assessment in the draft PA calculates that over 45,000 deaths in 2015 are attributable to long-term PM 2.5 exposure from air quality just meeting the current annual standard. The risk assessment for at-risk populations provides valuable insight into the positive impact of tightening the standards on reducing the disparities in exposure and risk experienced by communities of color. It finds that Blacks, the population group that suffers the most from particle pollution, will experience proportionally greater benefit from successively lower annual standards than any other groups. This would surely be a welcome outcome. Given the growing body of research finding adverse health effects at PM levels well below the current 24-hour standard, we urge EPA to recognize that the short-term standard set in 2006 fails to adequately protect public health. We do not believe it is appropriate or sufficiently protective to treat the 24-hour standard as a supplement to the annual standard. For communities in Alaska, parts of the West, and parts of New England, shorter-term exposures pose the primary risk because of the episodic emissions from wood stoves and other sources. Nearly all these areas have year-round concentrations that are well under the annual standard. Furthermore, heat and drought caused by climate change are leading to more spikes of unhealthy levels of particle pollution over time. In the Lung Association's State of the Air 2021 report, we found that for the 3 years from 2017 to 2019, close to 54.4 million people living in 88 counties experienced unhealthy spikes in PM air pollution. Many cities reached their highest number of days with unhealthy levels of PM ever reported, putting more people at risk. We would also urge the EPA to reconsider the form of the short-term standard, specifically to recognize that the 98th percentile form fails to protect public health. That form dates to 1997 and allows 21 days in the 3-year review period to reach levels well above the standard, not including the additional days exempted as exceptional events such as wildfires. The 24-year-old form allows excessive exposure under a standard that was established to recognize the harm from daily exposures. In conclusion, we urge the committee and EPA to heed the Clean Air Act requirement to set both the annual and the 24-hour standards with an adequate margin of safety, including ensuring protections for the most at-risk populations and health endpoints not included in this review. Based on the information in the draft supplement to the 2019 ISA and the draft PA, the Lung Association urges EPA to strengthen the annual PM 2.5 standard to 8 micrograms per cubic meter and the 24-hour standard to 25 micrograms per cubic meter. Please act assertively and with all due speed. Lives are at stake, and I thank you for full consideration of this testimony.
Thank you very much. Do any panelists have any clarifying questions or comments? Okay, I'll turn it back over to Aaron then for the next speaker.
Okay, our next speaker will be John Bachman with the Environmental Protection Network.
This is John Bachman. I want to thank CASAC and EPA for this opportunity. I represent the Environmental Protection Network, a volunteer organization of over 550 former EPA employees and others concerned about public health and the environment. I worked in EPA's Air Office for 33 years in science policy with a lead role in all reviews of the PM NACs through 2006. Having participated in the most recent PM review, we're grateful that Administrator Reagan decided to reconsider the unfounded decision not to strengthen the PM standards. We're also aware that the additional burden this has placed on the EPA staff to update the science and policy assessment in just a few months. We believe EPA staff has done a creditable job on both. That said, we have some issues that CASAC and EPA should consider in reviewing and completing these documents. Today, I outline evidence and perspectives we believe should lead CASAC and EPA to consider recommending significant revisions to both primary fine particle standards. The Clean Air Act gives CASAC a unique responsibility to review the scientific criteria and recommend appropriate revisions to the criteria as well as the ambient standards themselves. The policy assessments is intended to assist you and the administrator in determining whether and how standards should be revised. This CASAC PM panel includes experts well qualified to consider the extent to which recent studies have added to the weight of evidence and to recommend inclusion of any new significant studies that may have been overlooked. The daily standard. We agree the averaging time and form of the standard could be retained, but believe the record supports strengthening the level. The staff assessment of controlled human studies focused on a theoretical 2-hour standard, missing an opportunity to examine the implications of controlled human and panel studies with longer averaging times. We now have 2 controlled studies that find 4 to 5 hour exposures to ambient levels of PM 2.5 at 24 and 38 micrograms per cubic meter produce cardiopulmonary responses. By force-fitting such results into an equivalent 2-hour exposure, the PA ignores the implications of whether seeing effects at such low levels for 4 to 5 hours might carry over to 24-hour ambient exposures. Dr. Costa's comments today cite several panel studies in the 2019 ISA and a new study that's in the new ISA, but not in the policy assessment, that found daily and hourly effects on inflammatory and cardiac variables in elderly and at-risk people exposed to ambient air at or below the daily standard. Taken together, these lines of evidence buttress the results of large Epi studies in which restricted analysis found mortality and other serious effects at levels below the current daily standard. While we agree that more stringent annual standards would provide substantial protection against the cumulative exposures to repeated peaks, daily peaks over a year, the relative risk to individuals of a more limited number of peaks where the annual is not controlling should also be considered. Higher peak exposures from local sources to people of color means this also has implications for environmental justice. EPA should give more consideration to the level of the daily standard that is intended to reduce the risk of such exposures to the most exposed populations. Annual standard. The PA develops appropriate questions and useful summaries for key US and Canadian epidemiology studies in the ISA, sorting them by exposure methods, with attention paid to those using causal modeling methods, accountability studies, restricted exposures, and assessing uncertainties. Recognizing that newer work serve to reduce some past uncertainties, this section focuses most on uncertainties in hybrid versus monitoring-based studies. While this is appropriate, the discussion places too much emphasis on the importance of relating hybrid exposures to US design values, when the most important statistic should be an estimate of the overall mean concentration reflecting the levels with the highest number of people exposed, see PA figure 2.3. As in the 2012 standard decision, the standard level should reflect the central tendency of exposures in these studies, but not the study design value. The alternative justifications for standards as low as 10 and 8 should be reconsidered. It's hard to look at the results of in the PA figures and tables and agree that levels above 10 micrograms per cubic meter should be considered at all. Based on the 2020 review, the independent PM panel recommended a maximum of 10. The PA suggestion that only one US study found effects below 10 micrograms per cubic meter is inconsistent with data from several figures and tables presented earlier, unless only studies based on monitoring count. Similarly, the basis for levels as low as 8 should consider results from accountability, causal methods, restricted analysis, for example, the one from Wu et al. 2020 at 8.4 micrograms per cubic meter. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Does anyone have a clarifying question?
I'll add there's footnotes and things if you look at the version we sent in that has some references.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to turn it back over to Aaron for our next speaker then.
Okay, our next speaker will be Vijay Lemay with the Natural Resources Defense Council.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Vijay Lemay. I want to thank K-Sac for its service and for the opportunity to provide input today. I'm trained as a PhD environmental epidemiologist. I'm also a former EPA scientist myself, and right now I work at NRDC, the Natural Resources Defense Council. My comments today focus on PA Chapter 3, Charge Question 4, before you all, the equity implications of findings presented in the draft, and the need to further elevate the equity benefits of proposed alternate standards in the context of both federal commitments to advance environmental justice and two studies that highlight ongoing disparities in air pollution that have not been reduced over time by past NAAQS actions. Studies that were not cited in the supplemental ISA nor in the draft PA, despite their clear salience to the charge question. First, I want to emphasize that Executive Order 14008 makes it very clear that the federal government, including EPA, needs to change the way it's done things in the past in order to center and prioritize attention to address long-standing environmental justice issues. Specifically, the federal government has failed to meet that commitment in the past. It must advance EJ according to the order. Agencies shall make achieving environmental justice part of their missions. Of course, it's always been part of EPA's mission, although we need more action to achieve truly equitable outcomes. I want to focus on what the draft PA says in this context. While EPA identifies major health benefits and reduction in health disparities that can be achieved by the strongest PM standards, the draft PA does not adequately connect those dots in summarizing findings. On page 3-150, the PA notes crucially that Blacks will experience proportionally greater benefit from successively lower annual standards. Although even at an annual standard of 8 micrograms per meter cubed, Blacks will experience higher rates of premature death from PM2.5 than whites. This point needs further expansion in the PA. EPA should provide more detail on this finding by publishing the full racial demographic breakdowns of the populations analyzed in the full risk assessment. Draft PA section C.1.3 notes that the population at or above the age 30 in these areas is about 58 million people. EPA should provide adequate racial breakdowns in the entire document relative to this study area. Doing so would enable us to all better understand EPA's assertion that the risk assessment is a fair portrait of impacts expected across the country. I want to point K-Sac's attention to 2 studies that don't appear in the supplemental ISA nor in the draft PA, but are relevant to the charge question. The first, by Colmert et al., was published last year, titled Disparities in PM2.5 Air Pollution in the US. Researchers there combined more than 3 decades of PM2.5 data, looking at 65,000 census tracts. They found that differences in PM2.5 were between more and less polluted areas declined substantially, thankfully, since 1981. But the most polluted census tracts have remained the same since 1981. The most exposed subpopulations in 1981 remained the same in 2016. And overall, while absolute disparities have fallen, the relative disparities persist. Those findings were robust to using monitor data results and not sensitive to using different methods of PM2.5 estimation, including the mean and decile approach. The second study I want to draw attention to was published by Thind et al. In 2019, titled Fine Particulate Air Pollution from Electricity Generation in the US, Health Impacts by Race, Income, and Geography. In that study, it drew attention to the large issue of PM2.5 pollution from electricity generation. We have not yet known the full demographic distribution of pollution from that source. The study found that average PM2.5 exposures are highest for African Americans and that the overall average mortality rates for Black Americans are 25% higher than they are for whites. So disparities by race and ethnicity are observed in both of these studies, and they're independent of the effects of income. Clearly, Black Americans continue to be disproportionately harmed by PM2.5 nationally. CASAC should consider these study findings and the need for EPA to provide more detail on the equity ramifications of different alternate standards in the final PA. That work will help to clearly demonstrate the need for the strongest possible PM2.5 standards to protect human health. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Do any panel members have any clarifying questions or comments? Okay, hearing none, I'll pass it back to Aaron to introduce the next speaker.
Okay, our next speaker will be Chad Whiteman with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce.
Hi, thank you everyone for the opportunity to speak today, in particular, of course, EPA and CASAC. I'm Chad Whiteman. I'm speaking on behalf of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. The Chamber supports air quality standards that are necessary to protect public health and welfare, and our members will take the appropriate measures that are required of them to attain or remain in attainment of those standards. We believe EPA's decision whether to maintain or revise the NAAQS should be based on a holistic policy judgment informed by an unbiased review of the latest scientific evidence. Across decades of planning and investment, businesses have worked with EPA and their state partners to lower ambient concentrations of PM and other criteria pollutants. These emissions reductions have occurred while the US economy, population, and energy use has steadily grown. Undoubtedly a testament to successful collaboration between EPA, states, and industry to adopt new emissions control technologies and practices in a sound, cost-effective manner. EPA's 2020 air trends and national emissions inventory reports detail this progress. The reports show that annual PM 2.5 concentrations have declined by 41% since 2000, driven by major emissions reductions from highway vehicles and the power sector. as well as others. But total SO2 and NOx emissions, which may contribute to the secondary formation of PM 2.5 precursors under certain atmospheric conditions, were reduced by 85% and 53% respectively during this time period. Briefly, I will describe why we suggest the CASAC provide all appropriate guidance to the EPA to deliver to the administrator the information in the policy assessment to support his policy decision of whether retaining the current NACs or recommending a modification. We recommend you insist that any basis to distinguish between NACs options are quantitatively identified. Associated uncertainty should be evaluated when discussing any projected benefits that could form the basis for either modification or retention of the NACs. As a practical matter, it is important that CASAC recognize the potential direct and indirect economic impacts that can accompany more stringent NACs requirements. NACs compliance has the potential to adversely affect jobs, business investment, and permitting in a broad range of important economic sectors and activities, even having impacts in areas of the country that are in attainment with the standards. For the areas already classified as non-attainment under the 2012 PM NACs, any lowering of the PM NACs would layer on additional requirements on top of existing regulatory requirements, some of which have compliance states stretching out past 2025. Section 109D of the Clean Air Act requires CASAC to advise the administrator on any adverse public health, welfare, social, economic, or energy effects that may result from attainment and maintenance of such NACs. Any recommended revision to the NACs should consider the overall impact on economic growth and jobs, in particular for increasingly larger incremental revisions to the NACs. While the Supreme Court has ruled on the question of the consideration of economic costs when establishing new NACs, there's no contradiction between the prohibition on considering costs in setting standards and providing critical advice to the EPA administrator about negative economic or public welfare effects that may result from efforts to attain new standards. Current tools to address the NACs are being pushed to the limits as new, more stringent air standards are moved closer to background concentrations of criteria pollutants. The role of background PM in the NACs is of growing importance in regions throughout the country. The margin around background PM concentrations in the NACs is shrinking, leaving little space for reasonable economic growth and incrementally increasing the cost of compliance with the NACs. Natural background sources of PM are also an important consideration for the variety of sources contributing, such as dust from the wind, erosion of natural surfaces, sea salt, wildland fires, bacteria, and pollen, to name a few. As noted in the draft policy assessment, dust storms such as the one that affected Phoenix in 2011 caused peak PM10 concentrations greater than 5,000 micrograms per meter cubed. Dust combined with fires comprise 59% of national PM 2.5 emissions, far greater than major sectors such as stationary fuel combustion, which is 11%, mobile sources 5%, and industrial processes 5%. The lower the ambient PM concentrations, the more stringent the PM contributions will be from exceptional events such as prescribed fires and wildfires. In addition to domestic emissions from fires, PM from other countries can also be transported to the US. Considerable progress is continuing to be made in reducing PM emissions from commercial activities, while growing contributions from exceptional events and natural background emissions. We suggest CASAC place considerable weight on these factors when making the recommendation to the administrator. Thank you for the opportunity to submit these comments.
Thank you for your comments. Does anyone have any clarifying questions or comments? Okay, I'll turn it back over to Aaron for our next speaker.
Okay, our next speaker will be Samuel Delk.
Hi, everyone. I'm Samuel Delk. I'm a PhD student in toxicology. I'd like to thank the EPA and CASAC for hosting this comment section. In page 158 of this policy assessment, it's concluded that, quote, there is a causal relationship between short and long-term PM 2.5 exposures in mortality and cardiovascular effects. With my background in toxicology, I know how difficult it can be to demonstrate causality. And accordingly, I think this causality determination made by the policy assessment is flawed in that much more rigorous data must be presented before this determination can be made. When trying to demonstrate causality, toxicological models often have to use an ultra-high dose of the chemical agent with the animal exposed in a very particular way. So even in a perfectly controlled setting designed to show causality, it can still be difficult to pinpoint exactly what's going on. And this is even written in the report. On page 3-160, the PA discusses the animal toxicological studies that are used to corroborate the causality determination. But on the following page, the document itself cites the issues with these data, namely that, quote, uncertainty exists in translating the observations in animal toxicology studies to potential adverse health effects in humans. And then it goes on to say that the PM2.5 doses used in these tox studies range from 60 to 1,000 micrograms per cubic meter, which, I mean, even 60 is orders of magnitude higher than the doses of what people in the US are exposed to. So ultimately, this policy assessment is being informed by toxicological studies with issues in regards to translatability. And it's also informed by these epidemiological associations, which are then used to infer causality. So this doesn't seem like very solid science to me, and it doesn't seem appropriate to inform public policy and impose stricter NACs based on this. So these are a couple specific issues I find with the PA, but also consider the general system of publication in modern science, where there is, in my opinion, like an obvious publication bias against null findings. And this is something that is particularly evident in the toxicology field. You know, try publishing an article showing that your chemical agent is not toxic in any of your model systems. And obviously this is understandable in a sense why this is the case. And I know the K-Sac understands this as a panel of well-published scientists, but the issues that this publication bias creates is particularly evident right here when epidemiological risk ratios are used to inform public policy. Because if it's more difficult to publish a null finding, the effective result of documents like this will always be to impose more regulations based on a skewed set of scientific literature. Lastly, I think a question yet to be addressed is the extent to which changes in NACs would have tangible effects on human health, especially when there's still debate as to whether PM even has a direct causal effect. If PM2.5 concentrations in the US are among the lowest in the world, is it realistic to get them lower? And if so, would this even result in a detectable improvement for population health? So I'm a student of science that's after quality science that isn't blinded by a result that it seeks to prove. I just want policy to be informed by the best science possible. So thanks so much.
All right, thank you for your comments. I see Mark Weiskopf has his hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for your comments. Just more of a point of interest potentially. You may not be aware, but the journal Epidemiology actually has a express call and acceptance of what they refer to as convincingly null papers in an effort to exactly combat that kind of an issue. But obviously there are differences in one null paper from another, but they have that express interest in publishing those types of papers.
Interesting. Thank you for the comment.
Thank you. Anyone else have a comment, clarifying comment or question? All right, I'll turn it back over to Aaron to introduce the next speaker.
Okay, our next speaker will be Myron Arnowit with Clean Water Action. You're muted. Go ahead and unmute yourself. There you go.
Apologies. Sorry about that. My name is Myron Arnowit. I'm the Pennsylvania Director for Clean Water Action. I live in Pittsburgh, and I've worked for over 20 years with fence line communities to large industrial pollution sources, particularly in the steel industry in the Pittsburgh area. These fence line communities have been eagerly awaiting EPA to take action on improving the PM 2.5 standards in order to better protect their health. And I'm here to address some of what we've learned in the Pittsburgh area through this work over many, many years. Situation in Allegheny County, where Pittsburgh's located, needs to be addressed. It's been 14 years since the 2006 PM standard was set, and we're still arguing over whether we've reached it or not. We've had a strategy of waiting for upwind coal plants in the Ohio Valley to close, and many of them have, and we boast of improvements. But as a result, we've ignored the near field exposures from the steel industry, particularly U.S. Steel, which has PM 2.5 direct emissions that are greater than all the on-road mobile sources in Allegheny County, a county of 1.2 million people. Last year, Clean Water Action worked with the Community Coalition in Clairton, PA, home to the largest coke-making facility in North America. And we ran a program that was to get portable air cleaners into people's homes in Clairton, Pennsylvania. We received applications from 12% of Clairton's residents. We did health screenings for these applicants. 30% reported having respiratory disease, 28% cardiovascular. These are much higher than the national averages cited in the policy assessment. There is also studies by Dr. Deborah Gentile, an asthma specialist who's conducted several important studies of the effects of outdoor air pollution on asthma in the area, finding prevalence of 22% asthma among children who are near outdoor large PM sources in our county. In the policy assessment, two statements popped out which sort of related to why I'm telling you about this program we ran and how much disease we're finding locally. One is the statement that individuals with pre-existing disease may be considered at greater risk for air pollution than those without disease. And the second statement is there's strong evidence for racial and ethnic disparities in PM 2.5 exposure and PM 2.5 related health risk. So the question for me is, if we do think these greater risks exist, how are the NACs actually taking those into account? We think there needs to be a much closer look at how we are dealing with, for instance, the daily standard. Steel mills and coke plants have very batch-oriented operations. Pollution is not a constant, and it's something where looking at the daily standard is important. In 2019, monitors in Allegheny County averaged 12.2 micrograms per cubic meter. But we had 18 days over 25. 9 were over the current daily standard of 35, with maxing out at 66.4 on the worst day. If you average the days that were below 25, you would get 10.7. So a ratcheting down of the daily standard is something which we think there's a public health data for, but we also think that if you want to take significant action on improving the annual standard, you're going to need to address the daily standard, because that is the only way to get some of these large point sources to be able to make the changes that are necessary to allow the region to reach the annual standard. A couple other mechanisms in the daily standard that could be important are changing the 24-hour standard into a rolling 24-hour standard instead of midnight to midnight. The temperature inversions that we have 1/3 of days here in Pittsburgh are not ones that always match up with midnight to midnight. Also, moving to a 99th percentile would allow us to not allow people to be exposed to a weak dangerous pollution, just because we used to think that we didn't monitor our air every day. Now it's much more standard, and EPA has been moving agencies to daily monitoring. So we do think it's warranted to move the percentile back to 99 to provide greater protection. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your comments. Does anybody have clarifying question or comment? Right, I'll turn it back over to Aaron for our next speaker.
Okay, our next speaker will be Brent Bennett with the Texas Public Policy Foundation.
Hi, yes, thank you. Aaron, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Aaron, and thank you to the committee for the opportunity to comment today. I'm Brent Bennett with the Life Power Project of the Texas Public Policy Foundation. My background is not in air pollution. I'm actually an energy scientist. Primarily, my background is in energy storage. However, given my policy work now and the huge implications of what this committee and what the EPA does with regard to PM on energy policy, we think it's really important to state our comments here, and we appreciate the opportunity to do so. Now, many of the previous comments on both the policy assessment and the integrated science assessment cover the lack of evidence or gaps in the evidence for causation between PM and mortality, particularly at the low concentrations that we experience across most of the United States. And we've also covered these issues in previous comments and in a 2019 publication that I will include in our written comments on the policy assessment. So with that, I want to focus my comments here more on two specific aspects of the policy assessment, perhaps what I would call omissions in that assessment. The most striking omission that we see is the consideration not just of the health impacts of PM emissions, but also the health impacts of raising the cost of energy, transportation, industrial goods, and every economic activity that results from PM emissions. So yes, the Clean Air Act forbids the EPA from considering compliance costs when setting the NAAQS, and this myopic focus on the health benefits of reducing emissions is more a fault of the construction of the Clean Air Act and the process. However, we think it must be asked here in 2021, 50 years after the act was passed, when, if ever, the EPA will settle on a point above 0 or 1 microgram per meter cubed, where it deems the standards are requisite to protect the public health and welfare from any known or anticipated adverse effects, particularly if you continue to use the linear no threshold model. At what point will we reach the point of, where that requirement is satisfied? It's hard to say. Despite the profound weakness of the Clean Air Act in helping to answer this question, we think it must be addressed at some point. And therefore, we think the public health costs of lowering the PM 2.5 standards are a vital policy consideration for the administrator at this juncture. And that considering those costs in this policy assessment would be a huge service to the American people. So we think that's one omission that should be addressed. Second, the unprecedented experiment caused by the economic shutdowns in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic last year, in our opinion, cast serious doubt on the conclusion in section 2.43 of the policy assessment that background PM 2.5 levels across most of the US are less than 3 micrograms per meter cubed. When I say background levels, I mean levels, the levels where the levels would be if we took out all human emissions, all US emissions. So our review of the EPA's Air Now data set during March and April 2020, and this is a period when we saw vehicle miles traveled drop more than 50% in every major US city, and electricity production and industrial activity slow down considerably. So reviewing that data indicates that ambient PM 2.5 concentrations in most major US cities did not experience statistically significant declines during that time. And in Texas, which is what we've studied the most since we are in Texas, Houston and Austin actually saw slight increases on average compared to February levels. So again, and in hindsight, we've seen that many of the declines in PM 2.5 levels that were observed during that time were attributed to weather patterns, particularly in California. So the opposite was also true, because when that summer came around, Texas saw a large increase up to nearly 40 micrograms per meter cubed due to a Saharan dust storm. So in light of this, we wonder how the EPA can claim such substantial health benefits from reducing PM 2.5 emissions when weather can have such a large effect, a much larger effect than human emissions on PM 2.5 levels experienced by most Americans. We think that section 3.6 of the policy assessment, which covers future research proposals, should include a recommendation to review the current calculations of natural background levels and a more serious consideration of what happened last year and the data that we can glean from that. On the whole, the US already has the lowest average PM 2.5 levels of any country over 30 million people, and some of the most stringent standards in the world. And as this committee considers even recommending a lower standard for PM 2.5, We think the bar of evidence to justify that recommendation must become increasingly higher. The low-income communities that are purported to be helped by lowering the PM 2.5 standard are not just burdened by pollution, of which PM 2.5 is only a partial factor, perhaps negligible factor. They're also burdened by higher energy costs, limited transportation options, rising costs of essential goods, and unreliable electric grids, something we just experienced in Texas in February. So we think that this committee should carefully consider that and avoid a recommendation that would increase those burdens. So thank you very much.
Thank you for your comments. Panel have any input to the speaker? All right, seeing none, I'll turn it back over to Aaron for our final speaker.
Okay, our last speaker will be Kevin Cromer with American Thoracic Society.
Great. Thank you, Aaron. I'm speaking today on behalf of American Thoracic Society. Myself, I'm an associate professor of environmental medicine and population health at NYU School of Medicine, and I direct the Health, Environment, and Policy program at the Merit Institute of Urban Management. Before I get to my official comments on behalf of ATS, I want to thank EPA staff. It's thankless work to put together these documents. You do a tremendous job. I personally want to thank you. I think you're sensational, so thank you for everything you do. My comments today on behalf of ATS for oral comments. We have more details on our comments. The 2 points I'd like to touch on are thoughts on how to think about the hybrid exposure modeling and how that can inform recommendations on the standard. And the second point, we'll talk a little bit about the 24-hour standard and how that can be used to address hotspot concentrations. In terms of the hybrid exposure modeling, if you try to publish a paper in the last several years and you use something that looks like, central site monitor values for your exposure assessment, the reviewer comments would come back and say, hey, you need to use a more sophisticated approach. So you might, use some AOD retrieval data from ghost satellites. You might use a WRF-Chem model, put it in CMAC, use some machine learning to calibrate it to local monitors and come up with some really nice exposure data. The problem is, how do you then take that information, those results, and then apply it to a recommendation, which will be helping determine attainment status of central site monitors. The American Thoracic Society, what we recommend is that EPA reach out to study authors, if they haven't already done so in their manuscripts, to request to be provided the person-weighted average concentrations of the studies, as opposed to the geographically, spatially weighted average concentrations. We don't think that's overly burdensome. Many of our members are co-authors on these reports. We don't believe it's overly burdensome for our members. We think that information will better help interpret the results of the studies in making recommendations for specific levels. The second thing I want to touch on real quickly is the 24-hour standard. It's interesting to hear many different groups independently come to the conclusion this may need a little bit more focus. The American Thoracic Society agrees that this needs a little bit more focus. And the reason we've come to this conclusion is if you think about hotspot locations that are maybe not well represented by monitored values, think about the conditions that lead an area to have higher relative concentrations. Typically, it's some combination of topography and local emission sources. And even though you might have a circumstance where the annual standard at the monitor may be the controlling numeric standard relative to the 24-hour standard, thinking about the planning that will have to take place at the local level in meeting both the annual and the short-term standard, the short-term standard does a much better job of leading to the type of planning that will actually address the emissions that contribute to hotspot locations. So the traditional approach the EPA has used successfully in the past of looking at which will be the controlling standard, we don't believe is adequate to address hotspot concentrations away from monitor locations. And again, echoing what other commenters have touched on today about environmental justice, often, but not always, the hotspot locations are in areas of lower socioeconomic status, often higher percentage of minorities. There's clear evidence that these populations experience, in many cases, higher health impacts on a per unit basis. We need to do a better job of protecting these communities through the Clean Air Act. And American Thoracic Society believes that this is best accomplished through improving the 24-hour standard. Our review of the evidence feels that 25 micrograms per meter cubed is reflective of the scientific evidence.
That's if you keep the form of the standard the same. If we have a broader discussion on adjusting the form of the standard, as Dr. Rizzo and others have suggested, then maybe you adjust the level and the form together to get the goals you'd like to accomplish. Anyway, that's all we'd like to touch on today. Again, thank you to EPA and CASAC. We value your work. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your comments. Any input from the panel? All right, hearing none, I think we've reached the end of our agenda, and I think I turn it back over to Aaron to close the meeting.
Okay, so we will recess until tomorrow. And tomorrow we will start again at 1 p.m. Eastern time. And we will begin with EPA introductions, and then we will get into panel deliberations over the charge questions for the ISA supplement. So I think with that, we could be recessed. We'll see you all tomorrow.
Thanks, Leanne. Bye, thank you all.
Thank you.